spoke in April of, not April, he spoke there in September of 1859, near the steps on what we now call the old courthouse downtown. As you may know, we accomplished the goal of erecting that statue after raising $200,000 for the cost of the statue and the festivities and all that were involved, all the expenses. Now we have an 11-foot tall bronze Abraham Lincoln standing proudly in Courthouse Square in Dayton. But I'm not here just to tell you about the statue, but about the historical event that it commemorates. Let's consider what occurred in September of 1859 when Abraham Lincoln came here. He was invited to speak in several cities in Ohio, Columbus, Dayton, and Cincinnati, in support of the Republican candidates for the state offices that were being elected that year. Stephen A. Douglas had preceded Lincoln to Columbus, Dayton, and Cincinnati by a few days only, maybe a week. Douglas was a foil for Lincoln's argument against popular sovereignty. That's Douglas's characterization of how citizens of a territory should be able to vote whether to be slave or free when that territory came into the Union as a state. Now we're going to consider some specific facts of that event. Think about it with me. Lincoln traveled by train with his wife, Mary, and one of his sons to Columbus, where he met his escort, John Gurley, a U.S. congressman from Cincinnati. Lincoln spoke there in Columbus at the state capitol 2 times on September 16, 1859. The next morning, bright and early, the Lincoln party left by train for Dayton, arriving late in the morning to be met by many Dayton Republican leaders, including his friend from his old congressional days, Robert C. Skank. They traveled from the train depot at 6th Street north up Wilkinson Street. I want you to picture this. If you know Dayton, the railroad was exactly where it is now, and there was a station at the bottom, the southern part of Wilkinson. And what occurred was that a group of Daytonians met him and with his family, and they got into a spring wagon. Lincoln didn't want a fancy carriage, so they used an ordinary farm spring wagon to take the group north up the Wilkinson, those 2.5 blocks, where they got off in front of the fine home of Valentine Winters, prominent Dayton citizen who was the president of Winters Bank. The present building at that site is the old post office and U.S. bankruptcy court, which is on that corner, southwest corner of Wilkinson and 3rd. They're there at that home. He entertained them, that is, Valentine Winters entertained them, and they were joined at that home by another of other Dayton leaders, including lawyers Sam Craighead and Louis Gunkel, and a neighbor, Dr. Edwin Smith. Dr. Edwin Smith was a neighbor who came from across the street from his home to the Winters home. The interesting thing about that is that building, his home, is still there. It is now the Dayton Bicycle Club. Sits right beside the YWCA there on 3rd Street. and again is the home of Dr. Edwin Smith. Mr. Winters entertained that group at his home for a short time. Lincoln made a few remarks to the group, and then they moved to east on 3rd Street to the middle of Dayton, to the finest hotel in town, the Phillips House. Only about a year or so old, brand new hotel. And there they rested, Lincoln family rested, and they had dinner. I don't mean dinner, they had lunch there. And during the lunch, one of the escorts suggested to Lincoln that he take a short walk down east to the photography shop, about a block and a half on the East 3rd Street. And they did that. There, the photographer summoned a young 15-year-old painter to come in and sit. And while Lincoln was sitting for the photograph and daguerreotype, it is assumed that Lincoln said, "I hope you do well," as he saw him sketching, "but you don't have much to work with." Later on, that sketch and photograph, the following days, created a portrait of Abraham Lincoln without a beard, and it became known as one of the most reproduced likenesses of Lincoln because of the fact that he was without a beard. Then Lincoln arrived back at the courthouse for his speech shortly before 2 p.m. with then he spoke there for about an hour and a half on the important subject of the day, is the change of, anyway. Well, no transcript. What he was speaking about was the concerns I didn't. Anyway, to go on, where there's no transcript of the speech surviving, the newspaper reports inform us that Lincoln spoke countering Stephen Douglas and his concept of popular sovereignty, and against, here it is, the extension of slavery into the territory, which is the most important central issue of the day. Lincoln contended that the framers of the Constitution avoided mentioning the word slavery, and slavery was prohibited in the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. Furthermore, Congress reaffirmed its intent about slavery when it voted 2 years later to enforce the 1787 Northwest Ordinance in those territories. More evidence of congressional intent against slavery was the vote to prohibit the importation of slaves after the year 1819. Two newspapers reported that the speech ended with the crowd giving 3 cheers for Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was then escorted back to the Dayton Railroad Depot in time to board the 4 o'clock train for Cincinnati. He spoke down in Cincinnati that same evening before a huge crowd right on near the river for more than 2 hours with a well-organized speech which has been transcribed, and we have documentation for that. Now, articles in the local newspapers about the Dayton speech published conflicting accounts of Lincoln's speech, as you could imagine. There were 4 or more papers in Dayton at that time, some couple of Democratic papers, a couple of 3 Republican papers. But the editor of the Dayton Daily Empire, a Democrat daily newspaper, wrote, "Mr. Lincoln is a tall, spare man, dark complexion, with a pleasant countenance, and a long, slender, round head. He is not a very pleasant speaker. He cannot long retain a Dayton audience. The people look at him in a few minutes and then they walk on. The Daily Dayton Journal, a Republican newspaper, described this speech in a different way.
Sounds familiar.
Dave brought a large crowd of people to the appointed place, and for nearly 2 hours, the speaker was listened to with the utmost attention. Mr. Lincoln is one of the self-made men, without the advantages of education, who has risen to the proud preeminence which he now occupies in his own state and in the United States. Nor were the papers in agreement about the size of the crowd. Kind of familiar. In fact, we've had that.
They had fake news back then, too.
Another Republican paper, the Dayton Daily Gazette, had something else to say. They reported that a large number of people were there to listen. The Democratic paper, the Daily Dayton Empire, was critical of the speech in its editorial. They quoted themselves this way: "Instead of tens of thousands of persons being assembled in our city to hear Mr. Lincoln and the streets deluged with people, as one of our morning contemporaries prophesied the other day would be the case. A meager crowd of barely 200 was all that could be drummed up, and half of them were Democrats who came out of curiosity, and some of whom left after 5 minutes." So, following these Ohio speeches, laying out Lincoln's cogent arguments against slavery, are often credited with helping him become known in the Midwest and led to the invitation to speak in New York City. At Cooper Union Institute, he gave his finest campaign speech, which propelled him into the top tier of the candidates, the strongest candidates for the presidency on the Republican ticket. In May 1860, the Republican convention nominated him for president. After that, following in November, Abraham Lincoln became president. Then he faced the greatest crisis of any president in our history: secession and civil war. I thank you.
Thank you.